From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Shari. Now, how good is Shari? She starts her show with an exclusive. Within the hour, the rest of the media starts picking it up and it'll be a dominant topic tomorrow. That's the reason you've got to be there, not just at the start, not at the end, but all the way through Shari's program. And we, of course, get to fire up straight after it each and every night. Thank you for watching. Now, as you know, last year, $450 million, yes, no question, goes from 60-40 yes to 60-40 no. The Voice campaign, which the Prime Minister will say was all about the high-end ideals, but the reality was this was his way to get straight into the history books. He was going to pull a Kevin Rudd. If nothing else, in the first year of his first term, he'd achieved something big that no matter what failures were to come, he would always have that as his achievement. But as we know, the result was rather obvious. Here is the way that it was called on Sky News. When it became clear that Australia had said no, in my view, you look at the numbers, it was hell no. But a lot of people have intentionally misinterpreted that result. They've misinterpreted it as, that's it, we've dealt with the question, it's been rejected, no more discussion about Indigenous affairs. Now, that's wrong. But equally wrong are the people who have just gone on and ignored what the obvious message was about Australians and new instrumentalities, trying to discuss race in a way where you're not really part of the discussion. Which is why the Voice in South Australia is bizarre that it actually has now become a thing in South Australia. They've had elections for it in South Australia, despite the fact that South Australia voted against the existence of said Voice at a federal level, yet there it was, of course, at the state level. Now, on top of that, though, is a process which is playing out in certain paces at certain times, and it is an uncomfortable conversation that some people will not let us have, but we are going to have it, which is the treaty process. Something that I would argue is even more impactful to Australians than the concept of what words are in the Constitution and about whether or not a voice could be overruled by Parliament or it would be able to be never be sacked by Parliament. Because this is the negotiation where, from one perspective, you are trying to deal with original sin, and from another perspective, you are trying to move the ball forward. But of course, in the treaty process, you have a whole series of complications about whether a country can have a treaty with and of itself. But the activist Indigenous population says, well, we're not really part of Australia. You see, Australia was kind of pushed on top of us, so we are still a group of people who aren't really part of Australia, therefore you can have the negotiation with us. And what is up for grabs is the conversation that nobody has been willing to put any detail to. But before the next federal election, and most likely before your next state election, these negotiations take place as we speak. Now, there may well be a happy medium that can be achieved here, but all of us know that something seismic is going to change as a result of the negotiations. Now, in New South Wales, they've decided to fiddle around the edges with it, maybe, but no real detail is going to take place until after the next state election, which is more than 3 years away. In Queensland, they were starting to move through the process, but then the opposition have stepped out of that process, and therefore the government in Queensland says they're currently not going to be pushing on with that process, but a re-elected Labor government, you would imagine, would restart the process. So we get to Victoria, and Victoria is the place where the conversation of treaty is the most advanced. Now think of all of that debate and all of that uphill and all of that downhill about the Voice and how little conversation there is about a negotiation which could change interaction between our fellow Australians forever. Now, the treaty process in Victoria is one that had bipartisan support. But in fact, the Liberal Party stepped away earlier this year in part because of the result of the referendum, which, remember, even in Victoria was a hell no. In Western Australia, they're not too interested in the process either after the WA heritage law madness that was there at the start of last year, and things got way out of hand. So all eyes are right now in Victoria. Jacinta Allen has been cheering on this process and believes that it is the right thing to do. She will continue the work that Daniel Andrews put in place. Now, there's been no mystery about this being the want of the government. At the last state election, it was part of their policy. So, if you want to say that they had a mandate for it, well, that's what this government will say. But we're now starting to get into the rubber hitting the road. Put simply, demands are now starting to hit on the table. Friday of last week was the first of the planning meetings that were being held about what the Indigenous side of the treaty process is going to demand of the process. Now, the people who in part are coming up with this are the people who had been elected to the Indigenous Assembly, or the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. One of the people who is a member of that organisation is a person who has had previous jobs, among others, as being a co-chair of the treaty process, and her position being right at the front end, right at the sharp end of what is to be expected here. Now, at that meeting on Friday, these were some of the things that she put on the table as the forever changes to the state of Victoria that should happen through the treaty process. That apparently there should be local cultural learning places where language can be left alive, can be kept alive, and traditions can be kept alive. Whether this is Indigenous exclusive or whether kids from other backgrounds are invited to learn, who knows? But we get into the financial now. Total absolute exemption. No Indigenous people will pay land tax, stamp duty or council rates. They will be paid by every person in the country who is not Indigenous. Now, this is hundreds to thousands of dollars each and every year, and even bigger than that when we talk about stamp duty, about procuring homes. And while everyone in the non-Indigenous community would have to pay interest on their loans to pay off a house or a unit, dependent, of course, on what the interest rate of the financial institution is and what the interest rate of the Reserve Bank is, no, that wouldn't apply to Indigenous Australia. Indigenous Australians would get free tertiary education. There would be no student debt if you go to university or if you go to TAFE. There also would be a perpetual infrastructure fund. Now, exactly how much money goes into that, and the fact that that becomes separate than the state budget, which is all about roads and rail and hospitals, no, this would be specific to Indigenous communities. The true Indigenous story of Australia, that being dispossession, invasion, frontier wars, etc., 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 that would be taught in all schools. There would be designated seats for all Indigenous people on every single local council in Victoria, guaranteed. It is not stated whether these would be elected by the local Indigenous population or whether these would be appointed by the mayor. And then finally, there's a want for greater visibility of Aboriginal cultures. Now, some of this might be completely fine to you, some of this might be a lot. But that last bit is worth playing here, because something that has absolutely changed, and in reality, even though there are those of us who get a bit frustrated about how many times we're welcome to country a day, we can notice that things have changed over the past 10 years, and I would say by and large for the better, fine line at times, but by and large for the better, about a recognition of the Australia before 1770 and the Australia that we exist in now. But this lady says it's not enough. In fact, she thinks that there is not enough recognition of Indigenous cultures right now. Now remember, there's a welcome to country on Zoom calls now. But apparently one of the negotiating parts of this potential treaty making its way through Victoria and being negotiated tonight is this.
But when I went to school, I learnt about the ancient Greeks. And I learnt about the Egyptians, who their mummies are 2,000 years old. Hello? What do we see at Tullamarine? And I don't mean a flag or a few paintings. I'm talking about proper culture in the landscape. We are invisible, and we are invisible in our own country.
Now, I would disagree that that is the case, and I don't know what is the representation she is talking about in an airport. Because flight is something that is associated with a certain level of industrialisation. What representation is there supposed to be? Is it that the lands on which the airport have been built, what used to be there? Maybe, I don't know. But there's bugger all detail in this. Now, of course, the cost of all of this is an awful lot of money. And while a lot of people will say there's nothing to see here because it's not about property exchanges, it's not about saying that, X% of the Melbourne CBD will be under the control of this separate authority that doesn't exist now. The idea that your local council, who makes its decisions about planning, could potentially have unelected people on it with the casting vote is an absolute change to the democracy that we currently have. Now, the idea that has been previously put forward by places like the City of Melbourne was the idea that Indigenous people would be able to vote not just in the place they live, but also back into the City of Melbourne if they had a cultural connection to it from hundreds or thousands of years ago. That comes right up against the concept of one person, one vote. Now, these are the big questions. We are talking big questions here. Again, from those that are trying to advance the ball, they say that it's about dealing with original sin. But the reality is that if the buildings are going to stay here and the systems of government are going to stay here and the exchange of currency is going to stay here, well, then there is no reset button where we go back to a day where the ships never turned up. So you get to a scenario where, OK, all of the modernity stays here, but how do we negotiate? What do we negotiate around? And at the end of the treaty process, does anyone think that the Lydia Thorpes of this world will just simply turn around and say, cool, job done, high five. It's all OK now. No more protests. No more invasion day. No more screaming in the parliament. Of course not. Now, this is not an argument against going anywhere near these level of negotiations. But what I am trying to say here is that big changes are coming. The way that our societies have worked, fairly or not fairly, worked or not worked, depending on your perspective, they are going to change through this treaty process. Now, things like one citizen not having to pay interest on a loan, one citizen not having to pay land tax, one citizen not having to pay stamp duty, but every other citizen does have to pay those things. And what is the ultimate reason why one pays and one doesn't? It's race. It's culture. That is a confronting thing for us to be talking about. Because the idea that the child of an Indigenous adult today is going to be treated differently than the child of an immigrant Australian today is going to rancor with some people. But to give you an idea about how this negotiation is going to work, there are no red lines coming out of the Victorian government to say, no, that idea probably a little too much. Instead, all of this is on the table. All of this is not what I have made up. It is not the misinformation of TikTok or the bodies that they say denied Albanese his place in history when it came to the voice. This is the list of demands from her speech. The grab comes from their web stream. The Premier's response, this was it today.
And then it's then issues like this, and I'm sure so many others, they'll be part of the negotiations at the table. So I'm not in a position today to rule anything in or out about what might be considered through those treaty negotiations.
What is going to be fascinating here is just how open the negotiation process is. Now, I think that we've hit the moment now about transparency in almost everything that we do, that it should be televised. And if it's not televised, a reporter should be able to sit like they do in a courtroom where they don't film everything, but they'll be able to watch the negotiations. They said this, they said that. Instead, what's going to happen here is the politicians, which are going to be cushy and unaffected by whatever decisions get made here, are going to end up changing the way that things work and the way that we value people. Now, as a Gen Xer, I always thought that there was virtue in the idea that we didn't see race anymore, we didn't see gender, we didn't see sexuality. It was you do you. That the separatisms of the past were a problem and the togetherness of today was somehow going to produce a better result. Well, there are people amongst us who want to create a level of separatism, but this level of separatism changes power imbalances, where the majority of the population would be on the wrong side of that line. Whether you support it or not, that's the stakes. That's how big it is, and that's what's being negotiated as we speak. To even have this conversation is difficult and dangerous because automatically complaint here, complaint there, you got half of this fact wrong, you mispronounced this one word. No, the spirit of what I'm saying is that I understand that you have to deal with your past in order to be able to get to your future. The Gen X modern part of me says that to a degree we had already dealt with that past by acknowledging its problems. But there is an activist class that is absolutely determined on achieving a much different outcome than I think most people are truly prepared for, even those of us that are of goodwill to the process and understanding why the process is taking place. Now, let's talk about immigration again. I'm in one of those moods tonight. Let's deal with the tough stuff. Where? New Zealand, of course, got a brand new Prime Minister, Jeremy Luxon. He, of course, was able to form government after Winston Peters got together with the ACT Party, so he's there in a minority government, but he's making some big changes. You see, the people absolutely believe that Jacinta Ardern and her mob had got things out of control, particularly in the post-pandemic period of time about how many people were coming into New Zealand. Exactly the same problem that happens here in Australia. But they're doing something about it. We're holding press conferences with clueless Claire O'Neill. According to the BBC, let's go to that far right-wing news source here. Again, I try to show you the data each and every night, then we'll have our opinion on top of it and mixed in about it, but I need you to see where we're getting our info from. Low-skilled applicants will now have to fulfil English language requirements. Hallelujah. And are allowed to stay for 3 years, not 5, as had previously been the case. Under the tightened rules, applicants from most work visas will now have to fulfil requirements for skills and work experience. So you don't just get brought in for the job, you've got to do the work experience to prove that you're going to keep the job, which is why employers are responsible for ensuring that migrants meet specified requirements before offering the job formally. This is big. Now again, anyone who has half-watched this show knows that I understand the power and the necessity of migration. Again, the Gen Xer part of me, I don't care where you're from, I don't care what you believe in, I don't care what you look like, I don't care if you believe in this God or no God. But I believe that the laws of Australia are more important than the laws of faith or the continuation of life as if you were living back in the country of which you have come from. Which means we value women in this country. We will only let people of a certain age make decisions about things like whether or not they should be married. We believe that screaming from a lectern, a pulpit, a mosque, or anything else, advocating violence, at the very least inciting a form of hatred against another person because of what they believe in, not okay. But what I also see here is that there is a need for, wherever you come from, be it last week, last century, or even earlier, that we have to be able to coalesce around what the ideas of the country are, why the reasons are to be proud of the country should be, and that we should be able to communicate with each other. Which means you can speak whatever language you want at home, you can speak it in the streets, but the official language is English because it is the predominant language spoken by the extreme majority of people. And if you decide to go to a place like New Zealand, yeah, you probably should be able to speak the language, to read the road signs, all of that stuff. Well, that's New Zealand. And New Zealand has made the decision to put that in place because, like in this country, too many people have been coming over recent years. Why? Because they're trying to prop up their economy. But have a listen to the number that broke the New Zealand government and broke the people that meant that they wanted to change. I know we're on later at night in New Zealand right now, so good day to everyone watching us there. 173 people migrated to New Zealand last year, 173,000. That's it. To put that into perspective, all of those rules are now in place because 173,000 people went to New Zealand last year. In January of this year, 125,410 people came here. Yet no such conversation about trying to make sure, OK, if you say you've got the skills, come in, prove it, then you get your job confirmed, then you can stay for a while, but you're not going to be able to stay forever. There's not a huge family reunion scheme on the side of it, which means for every one welder you bring in, you could end up bringing in an awful lot more people who end up putting strains on everything from schools to hospitals to aged care and all in between. Dan Tehan, who is the Shadow Immigration Minister, he says this is a good idea. Now, again, this will be written up as some sort of lurch to the right and racism and all. I repeat, I don't care from whence you come. You're welcome. We love you. Labor should look to New Zealand to get some help to fix the mess that they've created. Labor's Big Australia saw a record 548,000 people arrive in the year to September last year. Australians are right to asking, where are all these people going to live? Oh, that's right. Because you see, yes, we do have a housing crisis in Australia right now, but we also have a migration crisis. And when the numbers of people is greater than the number of homes that you can build, let alone the families where the kids end up moving out and having their own, you know, it just, the population issue. Again, those who just think we can automatically, with very little effort, get to 40 million people have never driven on a busy road in Australia. They have never had to see a family member in the back of an ambulance because there is no room in the hospital, hence the hospital ramping problems that we've had. They have never had to apply for a rental property where virtually none are in existence, and if you try to get one, you get to pay an arm and a leg. And again, I talk about the Australian immigration system, where, again, the plan is if you've got a skill, I just keep talking about welders, and God love welders, if it's a welder or an engineer, whatever it happens to be, there's not enough here in Australia, so we've got to go searching for one overseas, in you come. Well, as I say, the family reunion system that exists under our immigration system, what percentage do you think of all of the visas that were given out last year was for the people who didn't have the skills, they just were the family members of the person who had a skill? Well, it's almost a third. In fact, the numbers that we had a look at today from the Department of Home Affairs, or sorry, I should say a quarter, was 26.9%. Now, in fairness, that number is lower than a couple of years ago, and the raw numbers are a little lower than even 10 years ago. But still, a quarter of all of the people who end up making up the numbers that pump up the economy and get us to big Australia are the family members of the person who has a skill. Now, in New Zealand, they're willing to say, come in with the skill, but prove you've got the skill, prove you can keep a job, then you get the visa. In this country, we have a government and an immigration minister who turned around and said, despite the fact you're not a refugee, despite the fact that you arrived by boat, despite the fact that every single indication was that you had to stay in offshore processing, and the offshore processing people slowly but surely put into the communities around the country, and the best part of what, 20, 30,000 people who were on a temporary protection visa. So if they actually did anything wrong, the reason they'd be booted out of the country is because they broke the conditions of the temporary protection visa. Nah, all permanent. All, of course, in the desperate hope that they thank their local Labor government and off we go. Now, that is not the great replacement theory. That is just the reality of what our immigration system is as opposed to what's happening in New Zealand. But the idea that, 173,000 was enough where they went, that's it, we're done, but it was 125,000 in just 1 month in Australia, to me says we've got a little problem. In fact, quite a big problem. And I don't trust clueless Claire O'Neill or that idiot Andrew Giles to actually deal with it. Now, more evidence that Aussies just don't buy the spin of the Prime Minister and his mates in the media when it comes to the economy. Now, again, according to those people, well, they think this is the Australian economy right now.
Everything is awesome. Everything is cool when you're part of a team. Everything is awesome when we live in our dream.
Good song, but still not quite the reality. And in fact, you know, I've been a little bit obsessed by talking about petrol prices and a little bit focused on the government actually doing something by cutting the taxation that they get out of it. Well, it's good to know the ABC has now discovered that the price of petrol is a problem in Australia right now. It's good to see the Daily Telegraph is echoing what we've been saying about petrol prices and how they are going to hurt people financially. I now look forward to all of those organisations getting behind the idea of putting some pressure on the government when it's planning a surplus, i.e. more revenue than spending, that perhaps they could take a little bit of that cushion, which last year was $20 billion, and cutting in half fuel tax. They could have done that for 6 months and it would have still been single figures of billions of dollars and they'd still have a surplus. Well, let's see whether that's the case. But of course, we know the Prime Minister and the Treasurer not interested.
No.
There's no way.
No way.
No.
No. No. No. No.
No.
No.
No.
Again, more evidence that we're on the right track, that the conversation we have each and every night is in the right place. Again, we see headlines today in the Australian newspaper. This was a survey which was actually done by the Resolve organisation, which normally provides polling for the Channel 9 newspaper, so hardly of the right. More than half of Australians expect a recession. Meantime, over in the Turnbull Times, in The Guardian today, 48% of people expect the economy to get worse in the next 12 months. 27% say stay the same, so all of the problems that we currently have now. Means, of course, we're deep into the 60s of people who think that we're in a world of pain or the pain is going to get worse. Apparently only 21% of people say it's going to get better. Meantime, the scapegoating of the supermarket industry is about to continue. Now, we know there was the changes and the announcements that all happened yesterday. And again, these are not perfect companies. There is no such thing. But the idea that these are the people holding Australia back, please. What about the policies of the government that just last year in the budget increased the taxes? Well, a show trial is about to happen with the CEOs of the supermarkets having to turn up to a grilling of senators. Now, you remember what this was like when it was Qantas that was the big bad and senators were, well, steaming up and waving their fingers till their wrists fell off.
You're not denying that the Prime Minister had a conversation with you about Chairman's Lounge membership for any of his family?
You are the most complained company in Australia.
You deferred your 2020, 21 and 22 long-term bonus shares again. Are you going to do that this month? Or have you chosen to accept these shares?
Don't you feel embarrassed? Because I tell you what, I'd feel embarrassed if I was you.
Well, again, they are going to be there, and all of those senators who, some are our mates, some are not, but all of those senators who were there and waving their fingers about Qantas. Well, remember the Labor senators who were the ones that in particular were trying to scream at Alan Joyce. Well, they all voted against the inquiry continuing into the problems with the company. Why? Because they got their man, they got their scalp, which means, of course, it wasn't that serious. As no doubt it will be the great finger-waving exercise that we will be seeing in the next week about the CEOs in supermarkets and senators holding up an example of something that used to cost this and used to cost that. Anyway, stand by for all that in the media to follow on, and that, of course, be the great distraction, where the supermarket bosses become exactly like the former boss of the Reserve Bank, and they're the bad guys. The government does nothing in all of this. Now, the government's not the whole problem, but the government is part of the problem. Yet the government says everything is awesome, nothing to see here, we can't do anything to help your financial situation, including increasing, not decreasing, petrol taxes, which, of course, is what they did. They distracted with the whole fuel emission standards, and the media went off on that, and then there was a great backflip, but the emission standards stay. The price disincentive is just slightly lower, and all of the dates still apply, which means the scheme still stands. I couldn't be a bigger John Farnham fan. I've seen him in smaller venues. I've seen him in wineries. I've even seen him at the supercars in Townsville. My beautiful friends, Betty and Daniel, shout out to you. My dear friend Trevor is an absolute John Farnham nut. And I know some of you have changed your views in and around the voice battle last year, but bugger all that, flush that. This bloke's an Aussie legend. And he is about to write a book. We've seen the doco, and now get ready for the book. It is The Voice Inside. It'll be coming out a little bit later in the year. And Farnham says about going back over history, which generally speaking he doesn't really talk about very much. It's a very strange feeling looking back on my life, on the good and the bad, and that I've started, and it's all rushing back. I hope the book engages and entertains, because that's so much of my life has been about. Now, may this pre-promotion of his book be taken into serious consideration by the people releasing the book. I want to talk to him. We'll give him the full hour to plug the book. I'll mention the bookshops you can get it in, but I want the chance to be able to sit down and have a chat with a man that not only I admire as a performer, but I think represents a certain type of Australia that all of us love, well, right into our bones. Now, as we know, every time a storm or a fire takes place around the world, it has something to do with climate change. Apparently all of this was invented only after the Industrial Revolution and only really became a problem in the past 5 years. You know, there's no previous history of natural disasters before 2019, right? And we know that every time these things come up, there's the same people saying the same things all the time.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Now, yeah, part of the picture, but not the whole picture, but you've heard it a million times before. Well, two things happened in the Americas, in the United States the past couple of days. One, there was an earthquake in New York City, thankfully. No real damage, no injuries, all the rest of it. And today there was a solar eclipse over the continent and making its way across the United States. But because all of these things are natural phenomena, what did a lefty idiot think an eclipse was?
We've got a solar eclipse. We've got the earthquake. She ran down the hallway. The rapture is here. The rapture's here. And then also I learned that the cicadas are coming. Cicadas. All those things together would maybe lead one to believe that, you know, either climate change exists or something is really returning.
Solar eclipse is now climate change. An earthquake is now climate change. Or that's just an idiot who knows if you say the right things, nobody will ever attack you. If you ever push back against the stupid things they say, they'll come right for you. And I'm more than happy for that to be the case. Quick break. Back with more. Plenty to talk about. In fact, a big debate tonight. Michael Kroger, Joe Hildebrand, and a whole lot more. So we're just getting started. Looking forward to this. And don't forget, Thursday night, 9 o'clock on the East Coast, very special edition of Paul Murray Live. All stars with everyone from Douglas Murray to Dave Rubin, Nigel Farage, Tony Loren, all of them. Here I am just dancing through the names. But you got to see me dancing. More in a sec. Oh, how good's this going to be? Looking forward to this conversation this evening. None other than the great Joe Hildebrand, who's kind of dressed up for us this evening.
I thought I'd throw a jacket on,
Look at you.
being Tuesday night, a little bit earlier in the week.
Fancy man.
I thought I'd just,
we still put the dress effort in.
Someone's got to keep it classy around here,
Towards the end of the week. And Michael Kroger as well. Lovely to see you, my friend. All right, so let's start first with you, Michael. And look, I can see Media Watch now, right? Oh, 3 white people talking about a treaty with Indigenous people. How dare they? But it's about the concepts, right? That we all understand what our histories are. We all will have some varying views on how they need to be dealt with or not with at all. But all of us also are sort of a generation that believes in equality. So the concept of one Australian paying tax and one not because of race seems to be a dangerous place to go, but the Victorian Premier seems to be okay with the idea, Michael.
It seems to be. But look, what's happening in the country is this. There is an Aboriginal industry made up of activists who have largely got government jobs, that love going to conferences in Canberra, that love talking about the politics of grievance, our history, etc., etc. That train slowed very much at the time of The Voice, where Australians said, stop trying to divide our country on the basis of race, stop the politics of grievance and history, get into the real world and do something about fixing the problems in the Aboriginal community, the real problems such as Alice Springs. Now we have this meeting on the weekend where they want to divide Australia again on the basis of race, that on the basis of your race you don't pay land tax. I don't think so. I don't think so. You get free loans. From whom? What, are Westpac meant to give out a free loan, are they? What about their shareholders? What about their profitability? Is the government going to provide free loans? What about other disadvantaged Australians who can't afford to buy houses? What about free university study? What about kids coming from overseas or disadvantaged people from rural Australia? Do they get free university education? No HECS debt, etc.? I mean, this list is quite improper. The government has to start saying no, as the Australian public said no to this country being divided forever on the basis of race. You need governments of courage, which was why I pay tribute to Dutton and Littleproud and that legendary woman Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine had the guts to fight against this racism and say no.
Again, you know, I keep talking about this Gen X idea, right, about people in their 40s and 50s, right? Again, the great achievement was to not see division.
Not see division based on race.
But
that's
now
right,
we have this scenario of a collection of people across multiple ages wanting to reinsert it, but to change, frankly, the power balance of it. And again, we're not going to relitigate the voice, right? But one of the things that people who were passionate about it said, well, it's not kind of about this stuff. Well, we're now left with this stuff, right? We're left with somebody saying that we should change the makeup of a local council. We should, I don't know what happens at Melbourne Airport about what's being suggested.
It's just an absolute grab bag of thought bubbles, and it's ridiculous. And frankly, I think it's pretty counterproductive and arguably even embarrassing when you look at the stark disadvantage that particularly remote Aboriginal communities are undergoing. I mean, the truth is there already is a vast inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and we know that every year when they hand down the Closing the Gap report. In some cases, it's even getting worse, which is shameful. But it is overwhelmingly Indigenous people in remote communities who are suffering the worst of that disadvantage. And that is a legacy of our history, obviously, and that's a legacy of both intended and mostly unintended consequences, things like disease and alcoholism and things they had no resistance to. And so if you actually make it an argument about disadvantage instead of an argument about race, then Indigenous people are going to overwhelmingly be the beneficiaries. And I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with having, say, interest-free loans to Indigenous families who can't afford their own home, or indeed where the idea of private home ownership is something that is very hard to establish in these communities.
But if that's a commercial institution that has to give them, the cost of that money is not free. If it's the government...
No, but the government is already putting billions and billions of dollars into housing, for example, and is doing that via a number of mechanisms. But again, I would not have a problem with saying, just like we have with social housing, all right, well, for every 100 home loans that you give out, you have to give one to a disadvantaged Indigenous person who's showing that they would have the capacity to pay that back, and they can get a private home. So one of the really big problems in Indigenous communities is there's often very little concept of private ownership. So you build, a housing estate there, and it becomes only as strong as the weakest link. It becomes only as strong as the person passing through who trashes it the most. Whereas other people, and again, with Indigenous people, Indigenous artists who friends and family of mine have worked with, they can become very successful, but then you have humbugging and every single relative comes on payday and says, so they can't get ahead, they're trying to get ahead. If you help them, that is the way to get ahead. Yeah. The problem is if you say, well, Indigenous people aren't going to have to pay any land tax, who's going to benefit the most? Well, the Indigenous person who owns the most valuable piece of property in Victoria. Whereas there are people who don't have houses or property or land at all. I
want to get to the supermarkets blame game in a second, right? But literally 30-second answers from both of you here. Forgive me. Michael, should this process be playing out more publicly? Like, obviously, I mean, all of these demands, all of this stuff that we've shown today, there's web stream and it was done in public, right? But when inevitably someone's having a negotiation, they're going to get in a room. Now, I don't know whether there's a camera there, but there should be a reporter there at the very least to see, because we are banging out, not a piece of legislation, but we're banging out something that is supposedly a meeting of communities here. It's bigger than your average kind of sign an NDA and we'll tell you what we're going to do with car policy. I'd
like to see what the government ministers say, question and answer, so you can You know, why, by the way, are we giving free loans? Why are we giving land tax relief? Why is this? What's the argument for this? Is it disadvantage? Is it race? So, yeah, okay, to take Jay's point, let's see these things played out in public. Let's see what the ministerial response is. Let's see what the questions are. Because this is being done behind closed doors. And if the Allen government is going to give in to this type of demand from activists, which is what Labor governments tend to do, activists, whether it's on climate, whatever, then the public needs to know. But is this a good idea? No, it's not a good idea whatsoever.
So, Joe, how public should this process be?
To be honest, I don't think the government even knows what it's talking about. I mean, from the comments I saw, you know, the Premier said that she hadn't even heard this suggestion be put forward, but she was open to it. And because she was open to everything, and that's right. If someone said,
say, I don't like the idea.
That's right. If someone said, I'm going to blow up that building as part of the treaty process, is that on the table? Because you want to negotiate in good faith. So again, I think this is a government that has been completely rudderless since the discipline of Dan Andrews left, for better or worse. And I think, you know, the carpet's been pulled back and it just doesn't know what it's doing.
All right, let's take a break. Lots of other things. We'll move into a speed round, I promise, after this, including the Senate inquiry, the politicians yelling at supermarket CEOs. Is this accountability or just a blame game? I think I might be leading the witness with my example here, but you think, let's see what Joe thinks. More in a sec here on Paul Murray Live. Thanks for watching. All right, Joe Hildebrand's here with Michael Kroger. Please convince me.
Yes.
Joe.
Yes.
That a bunch of senators waving their fingers at the CEOs of supermarkets is somehow going to change anything. Look, again, we can have a conversation about whether the Emerson thing does or doesn't move the needle, but can we all get over the idea that the Senate inquiry of somebody sitting and screaming at public companies does anything other than make a whole bunch of politicians feel like they're doing something?
Yeah, well, did you know there's actually a really big, strong body of work in psychological and psychoanalysis circles that shows that if you abuse people, make sure that there is no benefit whatsoever in them doing what you want them to do, because you've already cast them as a pariah and told them that they're not welcome as part of society.
Correct.
Back them into a corner and make them think that everyone's going to hate them no matter what they do.
Yep.
That always produces a positive outcome for society.
Doesn't it?
And
well, this is Jim Chalmers remaking capitalism.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily Jim Chalmers. I think the Greens are jumping up and down a bit, and I think the government is trying to sort of do the right thing. But again, I have been arguing publicly and privately for God knows how long now. Why wouldn't the government and unions and the SDA, which covers the supermarkets, is a really reasonable, smart union that believes in you know, moderation, economic growth, employment, as well as, of course, higher wages and better conditions. But they would happily sit down with all the supermarket giants and say, right, why don't you apply a bit of price restraint at that end? If you can make that case and if you can assure we won't be worse off, we will apply some wages restraint as long as we're not worse off. The government, you can make sure that, you know, there is health, you know, childcare, all the usual services so that workers get their benefit in economic ways. And you know what we could call it? We could call it an accord.
Yeah.
And it's already been done by Labor government, and there's, you know, the template. It saved us from inflation last time. Why wouldn't you do that this time instead of just making them the whipping boy where there's no public relations, there's no corporate benefit for them now in acting.
But Michael, again, the reason I kind of roll my eye at all of this, and look, it's a wonderful distraction from the media, but it is this game that all governments play, but this government is particularly trying to perfect, which is the idea of we're in charge of everything awesome and they're in charge of everything bad, right? The interest rates didn't go up because if anything we did in the economy, it was that evil bloke who was running the Reserve Bank. There's nothing to do with the lower Australian dollar because of government policy that means when things are imported into the country, they cost more money, or when they're transported to the supermarket, they cost more money, or when the power bill is on, it costs more money. Now, again, are they, you know, pumping up a bit here and there? Sure, every private company does because they're trying to get to a profit. But none of that conversation will be there. It's just going to be a bunch of CEOs being screamed at by politicians fighting for TikTok.
No, and we've seen all this before. But look, Paul, the only way this is going to be, the public is going to get any transparency or any sunlight in relation to this is if they publish the data with all the margins. What is a farmer getting for his carrots? What does it cost to get it to the, you know, to the wholesaler? What margin do they put on? Cleaning the food, transporting the food. all the margins along the way, the taxes along the way. What does it cost? Everyone's clipping the ticket. So from the poor old farmer who gets his amount, what is the end retail price? Where is the ticket being clipped the most? That's the only way the fog of this will be lifted. Otherwise, we're all running around pointing the fingers everywhere. Everyone's blaming everybody else. No one has any clarity at all, financial clarity, on exactly who's right and who's wrong. And until such time as that's done, this is just a meaningless debate of everyone pointing the finger at each other. I might add, though, supermarkets are not the only retail businesses in this country. One of the reasons there's so much focus on Woolworths is because they were one of the lead arguers of the Voice campaign, giving $2 million to the Voice. They brought a whole lot of opprobrium upon themselves, a whole lot of, opposition to what they did. The board, they were publicising this very strongly. I think it was Woolworths, was it, that stopped selling Australia Day merchandise. I mean, this corporate citizen is offside with ordinary Australians, which is why so many people don't like them any longer. And so part of the reason they're in the gun is because this company is not A-grade popular in this country anymore amongst the working middle class who are their customers, mate.
Yeah, and again, that's why I thought there was an opportunity to sit down, and as Mike says, right, how can you continue to make a profit but not make the super bumper profits that you made during COVID while trouncing the assistance?
It's a listed company, which means citizens and institutions are invested in the company making more money. So it's all this interrelated spaghetti that it's a lot easier for people to go, the evil company's just making massive profits. Yeah, there are people invested in them making profits.
Yes, exactly. But the point being, though, when you've got an inflationary crisis, you've got out-of-control inflation that's causing a spiralling interest rates. Why, when you sit down and say, right, we want you to still be profitable, but can you just suppress prices artificially for a little while? We'll take the hit on wages, and then when the inflation comes down to 3% or whatever, then we'll back end load that, or the gloves are off.
Well, they take your call,
that would have been.
But as complicated as that is, you know what we can do before that? Tell them to cut petrol tax, all right? Tell them to cut petrol tax, which they could do tomorrow. And if they're in a surplus, which they're probably going to get to for political reasons, as we told you last night, that will be the tax that they've increased on you driving around. Last one here. The seat of Wills, the seat, of course, that Bob Hawke at one point had, is now the latest battleground between the Labor Party and the Greens. It's an 8% margin, and the Labor Party would logically be able to hold on to it. However, current politics means the Greens are on a particular surge, but the Greens will only be able to take on this seat if the Liberal Party actually preferences them over Labor.
Yep.
Now, that shouldn't happen. But equally, I think Labor shouldn't preference the Teals in the seats where the Liberal Party are under particular threat. Michael, could that ever happen?
Peter Khalil is safe. I'll make this prediction now. Haven't had a wrong prediction for a long time, Paul. Khalil will win that seat. He got 38% of the primary vote. There's no way in the world the Liberal Party are going to preference the Greens after their disgusting display of anti-Semitism over the last couple of years. There is not one chance that the Liberal Party in Victoria or anywhere in the country will preference the Greens over Labor, even the most extreme Labor MPs. Like Wong in the Senate, etc., Tony Burke, etc., even they will get preferences ahead of the Greens. So Khalil is going to win, and the Greens should go the hardest because the more they stir up the Palestinian community, the more it turns the Jewish community against the Greens and a lot of other Australians of ethnic backgrounds that don't like this, drama that's being created in the streets of Jewish hatred in this country, and they think the Greens are involved in that. So this may backfire on the Greens quite badly, not only from the Jewish community, from other communities that just don't like the way the Greens are going about this. It's the Jews today. Who's to say it's not the Hindus tomorrow?
Well, what a political genius the leader of the Greens is. She's just been re-elected to a however many year term in the upper house. No, she's going to give it all away to run deep second to Labor in the seat of Wills. All right, we're done. Thank you so much, Joe. The jacket, very impressive. And you got an extra 30 seconds of chat. And the wonderful Michael Kroger. We'll see you again very soon. About 5 minutes away from the late debate. But before that, I've got to tell you about the Australian of the Day. That's our show for tonight. Megyn Kelly on tomorrow, the All-Stars from all around the world, of course, on Thursday night. Now, as I said, the Australian of the Day. Well, it hasn't been decided yet. There's, in fact, going to be a knife fight to the finish. Think of this as cockfighting on television. It'll be decided by the end of the late debate. Whoever is still breathing at the end will be the Australian of the Day.